For most of history, governments could not simply create money. If rulers needed more funds, their options were limited. Gold had to be mined, silver had to be collected, coins had to physically exist before they could be spent. Money was constrained by the supply of metal, but the introduction of paper currency slowly changed that limit. Paper money allowed governments to expand the supply of currency far more easily than before. New notes could enter circulation through banks, treasuries, and financial systems. In practical terms, governments gained the ability to print more. This shift did not only change how money moved, it changed how economies behaved. Over time, a pattern began to appear. Prices slowly increased. The same amount of money bought slightly less than before. Year after year, the value of money gradually declined. Economists gave this process a name: inflation. And once inflation became visible in modern economies, it raised an unusual question about how financial systems actually operate. Most people learn early that inflation is harmful. When prices rise, savings lose purchasing power. Money stored today may buy less in the future. For households and businesses, this creates uncertainty. Planning becomes harder when the value of money slowly changes. Because of this, stable prices are often seen as a key goal of a healthy economy. Low inflation is praised. High inflation is widely criticized. The logic seems straightforward. If inflation weakens the value of money, the ideal economy would eliminate inflation entirely. But when economists study real economies over long periods, that expectation rarely appears. Across economic history, inflation repeatedly returns. It appears across different countries, decades, and political systems. Sometimes inflation rises quickly, sometimes it remains low and stable, but it rarely disappears completely. Even stable economies tend to experience gradual price increases over time. Money slowly loses a small portion of its value year after year. This pattern has persisted across generations. And its persistence suggests something important. Inflation may not simply be a policy mistake. It may be connected to deeper forces within modern financial systems. This creates a quiet contradiction inside modern economies. If inflation reduces the value of money, and if stable prices are considered a goal of economic policy, why does inflation continue to appear so consistently? Why do many economies operate with small, steady inflation instead of eliminating it completely? And why do policymakers often aim to manage inflation rather than remove it entirely? To understand why, we need to look at the financial pressures governments face when managing large economies. But if inflation reduces the value of money, why do governments continue allowing it to exist? This channel explores how hidden economic forces shape money, power, and stability across history. If you enjoy examining the systems behind these patterns, subscribe to continue exploring how economies and institutions quietly evolve. Modern governments manage financial responsibilities on a very large scale. National budgets fund transportation networks, healthcare systems, education programs, and social safety nets. Governments maintain military forces, public administration, emergency services, and large public infrastructure. Many of these commitments do not disappear once they are created. Roads must be maintained. Hospitals must remain open. Retirement systems must continue paying benefits. Over time, these obligations often expand rather than shrink. Populations grow, infrastructure ages, public programs reach more people. Each decade adds new layers of responsibility, and once programs become part of the economic system, reducing them becomes extremely difficult. As a result, government spending tends to rise alongside the growing complexity of modern economies. The challenge is not simply paying for today's responsibilities, it is managing commitments that extend far into the future. In theory, governments have two clear options. They can raise taxes or they can reduce spending. But both choices involve serious consequences. Higher taxes can slow economic activity. Businesses may invest less, and households may spend less. Large tax increases can weaken economic growth at the moment governments depend on that growth to sustain public finances. Cutting spending creates a different problem. Public programs often support essential services such as healthcare, infrastructure, and retirement benefits. Large reductions can disrupt systems that citizens rely on daily. Because of this, governments rarely have the freedom to make dramatic adjustments in either direction. Instead, policymakers must constantly balance financial stability, economic growth, and public expectations. And this balance becomes even more complicated when governments turn to borrowing. Borrowing allows governments to spread financial costs across time. Instead of raising taxes immediately, governments issue bonds that investors purchase. These bonds function as loans to the state. Governments receive funding today and promise to repay it later with interest. This system allows infrastructure projects, economic stimulus, and crisis responses to be financed without immediate financial shock. But borrowing creates long-term consequences. Debt does not disappear once it is issued. It remains on government balance sheets for years, sometimes decades. Interest payments accumulate. And as total debt grows, a larger share of government budgets may be dedicated to servicing those obligations. Across many countries, public debt has gradually increased over long periods of time. Managing this expanding debt becomes one of the most persistent financial challenges governments face. And it is here that inflation begins to quietly influence the system. Inflation changes the real value of money over time. As prices rise across an economy, each unit of currency slowly loses purchasing power. This affects wages, savings, prices, and financial contracts, but it also affects government debt. Most government bonds promise repayment in fixed monetary amounts. If inflation occurs over time, the purchasing power of those future payments becomes smaller than when the debt was issued. The government still repays the full number of currency units, but the real economic value of that repayment may be lower. This process does not eliminate debt. However, it can slowly reduce the real burden of that debt. Because inflation operates gradually across an entire financial system, this effect often unfolds quietly. Over long periods, even small levels of inflation can shift how financial pressures are distributed across the economy. If inflation quietly changes the real weight of debt across an economy, why do modern economic systems intentionally maintain small, stable levels of it instead of eliminating it entirely? In modern economies, inflation is not left entirely uncontrolled. Most countries assign the responsibility for managing inflation to central banks, institutions designed to guide monetary stability. Central banks influence the supply of money, regulate financial conditions, and attempt to maintain confidence in the monetary system. One of their most visible goals is controlling inflation. But controlling inflation does not usually mean eliminating it. In many economies, central banks openly aim for small, stable levels of inflation, often around 2% per year. At first glance, this policy can seem unusual. If inflation slowly reduces the value of money, why would policymakers intentionally maintain it? Why not aim for perfectly stable prices? The answer lies in how modern economies constantly adjust and evolve. Prices, wages, and industries are always changing. A small amount of inflation allows those adjustments to occur more smoothly. Instead of trying to freeze prices completely, policymakers attempt to keep inflation predictable and limited. This approach reflects the recognition that eliminating inflation entirely may create problems of its own. An economy with zero inflation might sound ideal. In theory, the value of money would remain perfectly stable, but real economies rarely move in perfect balance. Some industries expand quickly while others decline. If prices cannot adjust gradually, these shifts can become more disruptive. Businesses facing weaker demand may be forced to cut wages or reduce employment to remain competitive. Debt burdens can also become heavier. When the value of money remains fixed, the real weight of existing debts does not gradually adjust over time. For borrowers, including governments, this can make financial obligations harder to manage. Because of these pressures, many economists see small, stable inflation as a buffer that allows the economic system to adapt. Instead of eliminating inflation, policymakers attempt to keep it within a narrow and predictable range. Central banks do not directly control prices across an economy. Instead, they influence the financial environment in which economic activity takes place. One of their most important tools is interest rates. When central banks raise interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive. Businesses may slow investment and households may reduce spending. Economic activity cools, which can slow price increases. When central banks lower interest rates, borrowing becomes easier. Investment and spending can expand, allowing economic activity to grow. These adjustments indirectly influence inflation. Rather than dictating prices, central banks guide the financial conditions that shape economic behavior. Through these tools, policymakers attempt to keep inflation stable while supporting economic growth. Over time, this approach has reshaped how economists think about inflation. Instead of treating inflation only as a policy failure, modern systems often treat it as something that must be carefully managed. Too much inflation can destabilize an economy, but inflation that is too low can also create pressure, especially when debt levels are high and growth slows. Because of this, many financial systems aim to maintain a narrow zone where inflation remains present but controlled. In that environment, inflation becomes part of the system's normal operation. It allows prices, wages, and financial obligations to adjust gradually over time. And while the public experiences inflation as rising prices, within the broader system, it quietly redistributes financial pressure across the economy. But if inflation redistributes financial pressure across an entire economy, could it actually be part of what keeps modern financial systems stable? By this point, inflation begins to look different from the way it is often described. Instead of appearing only as a problem to eliminate, inflation can also function as a mechanism that quietly redistributes financial pressure across an economy. As prices gradually rise, the value of money slowly changes for everyone in the system. Wages adjust over time. Prices of goods shift. Debt contracts remain fixed while the purchasing power of money changes. These adjustments do not affect everyone equally. Borrowers may repay loans with money that is slightly less valuable than when those loans were issued. Creditors receive repayment in nominal terms but may experience lower real purchasing power. Households, businesses, financial institutions, and governments all experience these shifts differently. Because inflation unfolds gradually across millions of transactions, this redistribution rarely appears as a single visible decision. Instead, it spreads quietly across the financial system. For governments managing large economies, this gradual adjustment can create an important form of flexibility. Modern states carry long-term commitments. Public debt must be serviced. Infrastructure must be maintained. Social programs must continue paying benefits. If the value of money remained completely fixed, these obligations would remain equally rigid. But inflation allows the real value of many financial commitments to adjust slowly over time. Over long periods, even small inflation can reduce the real weight of existing debt relative to the size of the economy. This does not remove responsibility. Governments must still repay debt and maintain economic credibility. But inflation allows part of the adjustment to occur gradually rather than through sudden policy shocks. This helps explain why inflation rarely disappears entirely from modern economies. Even when policymakers attempt to control it carefully, inflation tends to remain present at low levels. It allows prices, wages, and financial obligations to evolve as economies grow and change. It provides flexibility when governments respond to recessions, financial crises, or expanding public commitments. And it spreads financial adjustment across the economy rather than concentrating it in one moment. Because of these effects, inflation becomes embedded within modern monetary systems. It is monitored carefully. It is limited through policy, but it is rarely removed completely. This reveals a deeper reality about modern money. Inflation is often understood only through rising prices, but inside modern monetary systems, it also plays a structural role. It allows economies to adjust gradually as conditions change. It shifts financial pressure between borrowers and lenders, and it gives governments limited flexibility when managing debt and economic shocks. Small, controlled inflation has therefore become embedded within the structure of modern financial systems. This channel explores how economic systems quietly shape money, power, and stability across history. If you find these hidden mechanisms interesting, subscribe to continue exploring how financial systems evolve. When people experience inflation, they usually notice only rising prices. But behind those changes lies a deeper system of incentives and constraints. Inflation may reduce the value of money, yet within modern economies, it also helps financial systems absorb pressure and adjust over time. That is why policymakers rarely attempt to remove it entirely.